Earth, home to millions of different life forms. On land, on water, and in the air. But one highly invasive species in particular is spreading. Us. There are now a good 8 billion people. We are spreading like mold. Adaptable, without natural enemies, no wonder we're thriving. But how much longer can this go on? The world population continues to grow. According to the United Nations, we'll be around 10.4 billion people by the end of the century. 10.4 billion residents who eat, drink, consume resources. What if there were not enough for everyone? Some claim that there are already far too many of us. Is that true? And if so, who exactly is too much? This is what most people think of when they think of overpopulation. Too many in a small space. Like in Mumbai, Medellin or Lagos. Cities with high population density and major social problems. But some areas of Europe are also extremely densely populated. There's a quite confusing level of overcrowding. Here. Monaco, not exactly a slum. The population density is almost 3 times as high as in Hong Kong. So overcrowding alone is probably not the problem.
Overpopulation occurs when there are more people living in a region than can be sustainably supplied with food and other goods.
Long-term and sustainable supply. That doesn't work everywhere. But are too many people really at the heart of the problem? Let's compare 2 classic texts. Genesis, the band, sang in 1986. Too many people making too many problems. Genesis, the book, on the other hand, said a few thousand years earlier,
"Be fruitful and multiply."
At some point between the book and the tape, too many people became a problem. And this some point can be determined fairly precisely. To the year 1798.
Robert Malthus was a British economist, also a clergyman, who wrote a very influential paper towards the end of the 18th century on the principle of population, where he was actually the first thinker to come up with the idea that it was a problem, that the population was growing too fast.
At the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution led to enormous upheavals in England. People flocked from the countryside to the cities in search of work. Many lived in misery and had numerous children.
And then something started to happen. The birth rate remained high and infant mortality fell. Overall life expectancy increased, and suddenly the population grew enormously. Malthus's core thesis was that unlimited population growth must lead to a shortage of food supplies, because the population increases exponentially and the food supply can only grow linearly. And sooner or later, the demand from the increased population will far exceed what is actually available.
Malthus saw it this way.
A man who is born into an already occupied world and whose family has not the means to feed him, or whose labour is not needed by society, has not the smallest right to even a little food. Nature commands him to resign, and she does not hesitate to carry out this command herself.
And this is a time when there is no contraception. This is the late 18th century. So he is thinking in terms of, therefore, natural disasters, and which will happen to control our population. So pestilence, famine, etc. But he is also making a very strong case for abstinence. If the poor are allowed to reproduce as they please, then there will be too many of them. And if the state decides to give them welfare, then they will have more children.
Questionable views, but they were well received. The Whig Party in power in England made them the basis of the reformed, that is, worsened, poor laws, including forced labor in so-called workhouses. A system that was only abolished at the beginning of the 20th century. And it explains why the British government more or less let the famines in Scotland and Ireland run their course. 1 million people died during the Irish famine from 1845 to 49, 12% of the population. 2 million more left Ireland. Okay, powerful men with bad ideas cause hardship and misery. So far, so unsurprising. But surely later generations took a smarter approach. 170 years later, in the Love and Peace era of the 1960s, another man was looking for a solution to the population problem. The biologist Paul Ehrlich. Not to be confused with the Nobel Prize winner for medicine of the same name.
Paul Ehrlich goes in 1966 to India, and when you read what he writes on it, it's very much about how disturbing he finds the sights and smell of the Indian slum and the sight of all these poor people, so many of them who are, just too many in numbers, but also that they are living, sleeping, bathing on the streets, and it stinks, and he just hates the sight of the poor in India.
Traumatized, Paul Ehrlich poured his experiences in India into a bomb of a book, The Population Bomb. Quote,
"The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, despite all the emergency programs. Nothing can prevent a significant increase in the global mortality rate. By 1985, enough millions of people will have died to reduce the Earth's population to an acceptable level, around 1.5 billion people."
As we know today, complete nonsense. But Ehrlich was extremely charismatic and influential.
I'm happy to tell you that there are solutions to these problems. I think if we did a lot of things and did them right, we could probably buy ourselves a 50-50 chance of getting to the end of the century. Some of my colleagues disagree, but I think it's at least worth a try. For the first time, we have got to really try and help the rest of the people in the world. And that means a tremendous effort on population control, which will mean training many, many sociologists, anthropologists, and so on in the overdeveloped countries and sending them down there to try and get the job done.
Ehrlich was not alone with these ideas. The problem was also seen at UN level, particularly in the global South.
In the 1960s, many family planning programs were initiated and financed by the global North with the aim of curbing population growth.
India itself had already launched a program to limit population growth in the 1950s. Through education and the distribution of contraceptives, and through cash bonuses for men who voluntarily underwent sterilization.
There was a lot of international pressure, and the pressure was from international financial institutions, from the US government, but also, you shouldn't forget, the Indian middle classes shared the same mindset when it came to the question of so-called overpopulation. So they were also convinced that the poor were too many.
And the voluntary programs were just the beginning.
1975-77, this is Mrs. Gandhi's government, which imposes the emergency at that particular point of time for 2 years. And during the emergency, they then have a program of forced sterilization. So this is the time when they use police and army to sterilize over 4.5 million men in India.
4.5 million forced sterilizations, plus a broad-based contraception campaign. And the industrialized countries may have wanted to curb global population growth not only out of concern for the poorest of the poor.
It's always countries in the global south, in Africa, in Asia, who are too many. And of course, if there are too many, then they will use up their own natural resources. So the US government is very interested in making sure that it is able to use the resources of these countries, so they shouldn't use up their own. So population control is seen as something which would enable distribution of resources from the global south to the global north.
When there's such a grand narrative that population growth is a major threat to humanity, in fact, threatens humanity and the planet, then of course this also acts as a potentially dangerous justification for really massive interventions.
Such as in China. In the 1980s, they tried a different way of controlling the next generation, the one-child policy.
One child per family, no more is allowed. With condoms and birth control pills in hand, the so-called neighbourhood women arrive unexpectedly at the homes, admonitions, instructions and a scrutinising look at the young mother's belly. If a second child is announced, the woman is either forced to have an abortion or the couple is threatened with heavy fines.
This had even more far-reaching social effects. On the one hand, there was a preference for male children. Suddenly, you see in the population statistics that there are many more men than women in these age groups. In addition, there were social issues such as the fact that a society is naturally not unaffected by the sudden emergence of a whole generation of only children, and what that means psychologically and socially. That there were children who were under great pressure, expected to carry on the family and so on, who were all somehow socialised in a particular way.
This policy was only ended in 2016. Has it at least achieved the desired success?
In China, the number of children per woman was already declining before the one-child policy was introduced. It's difficult to say in retrospect whether the population trend would have been significantly different without this one-child policy. In fact, it's to be expected that the decline in birth rates would have continued even without this policy.
Nevertheless, such programs met with the approval of the UN for decades.
It was not until 1994, at the Population Conference in Cairo, that such family planning programs, some of which relied on coercion or pressure, were abandoned.
Family planning programs that were only treating the symptoms anyway. The crucial question is, why do poor people have so many children in the first place?
You actually have to assume that children are investments in the future, and poor people in poor countries generally do not have the opportunity to invest sufficiently in their children, and therefore the large number of children for whom there is insufficient investment leads to poverty. And poor people then in turn do not have the opportunity, or often don't have the opportunity, to reduce the number of children.
So if poverty is the reason for a high birth rate, wouldn't the smart thing to do be to invest in combating it? And indeed, better healthcare, more education, and the promotion of gender equality have turned out to be effective ways of reducing poverty and the number of children. We could have figured this out earlier. After all, these findings are based on a population economics theory from the 1940s. The demographic transition. The graph shows how population figures have developed in 4 successive phases. That's how it went in Europe. Until the 18th century, life was no fun for most people. Food was often scarce and poor quality, medicine was more like quackery, and nobody had heard about hygiene. People had a lot of children, most of whom never reached adulthood. Epidemics, famines, and occasional wars killed many people. And so the world population remained relatively stable for a long time. This changed when new agricultural techniques and industrialization drastically improved living conditions. There was more and better food. Progress in technology and science also brought progress in public health care and general hygiene. People were suddenly living longer and many children were still being born, only not as many of them were dying. The result? The total population suddenly grew enormously. When it became clear that most children were surviving into adulthood, many parents no longer saw any reason to continue having many children. They opted for fewer offspring, but were better able to support them. The increasing employment of women also played a role in this. Population growth slowed down, and in the long term. This development is being repeated in all corners of the world. One country after another is undergoing the demographic transition. The final result is always a high life expectancy and a low birth rate.
The countries of the global north have all been in phase 4 for several decades. In the global south, it is indeed the case that the decline in birth rates in phase 3 has already begun in all countries.
But is there any evidence that more education and the advancement of women actually leads to fewer children being born?
In the 1960s, an average of 5 children were born per woman. Today, it is 2.5 children per woman, and the birth rate will continue to fall. By the middle of the century, it's expected that the global birth rate will fall below the replacement level of 2.1 children. The number of children and young people under the age of 15 is just reaching its maximum. Peak child, meaning the point at which the number of children and young people as a proportion of the global population stops increasing, has therefore just been reached. The UN is forecasting a population peak of 10.4 billion people by 2086. After that, according to the forecast, the world's population will very slowly begin to shrink.
So 10.4 billion. Can they all be provided for? Let us remember the prophets of doom, Ehrlich and Malthus. Why did their predictions not come true? Because they both completely ignored how inventive we humans are. In the case of Malthus, for example, it was Jethro Tull. No, that's the wrong Jethro Tull. This Jethro Tull, a British agricultural economist, the inventor of the automatic sewing machine and co-creator of the British agricultural revolution of the 18th century. This led to a 2- to 3-fold increase in yields per hectare, depending on the type of crop. And Paul Ehrlich was overrun by the Green Revolution, which gave mankind new, extremely high-yielding varieties in the 1960s. The famine catastrophes prophesied by Ehrlich in India, for example, never took place.
Once the Green Revolution is successful, Indian food supply is much in excess of its own consumption and demand. So India is a food exporting country.
The fact is that the food produced worldwide is enough for 11 billion people. There is no problem with quantity, only with distribution. We are tapping into new sources of food, high-quality protein from insects, for example, and new cultivation methods can solve the problem of limited arable land. So peace, joy, and fly omelette. Or not?
We need more than the earth can renew. We call this disease overshoot.
Ah, right, that was something else.
Overshoot is the difference between how much nature we have and how much nature we consume. We can also measure the overshoot. How much nature do we have? How much nature do we need? We have productive areas such as lakes, forests, fields, wetlands, etc. And vice versa. How much do we need? For food, for wood, for our houses, to absorb the CO2 from fossil energy consumption. That is the ecological footprint. What we see when we take stock is that we need much more than what we have. Globally, we have about 1.5 hectares per capita, but we need 2.7. If we want everyone to be able to live well within the Earth's capacity, ideally, it would be better for humanity to need about half the Earth's capacity in order to keep biodiversity stable. Well, we can choose. More people, less footprint per person, or less people and more footprint per person. If we want to maintain the world's current average footprint, then we would now be about 3 times too big as a human race.
A British research group wanted to know even more precisely. They calculated how many people could the Earth support if we carried on as we do today. Answer: 3.3 billion. And how much would we have to limit ourselves so that we can live reasonably comfortably, even with 9 billion people, but still not overburden the Earth's habitat? Answer: the global gross national product, and thus the standard of living, would have to be reduced to around that of the year 2000. That would of course be a first world problem.
It's a fact that a child born in one of the poorest countries, where it has no access to a car, a house, possibly with air conditioning, lots of consumer goods, cannot go on long-distance trips. Such a child contributes relatively little to the global footprint. However, the 10% richest of the world's population consume 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Der globalen Treibhausgasemissionen.
It would be helpful to have a forward-looking industrial policy that not only focuses on profits, but also sets the well-being of future generations as its goal. For example, by promoting environmentally friendly technologies and heavily taxing environmentally harmful ones. And what about us personally? In 2017, Swedish and Canadian researchers calculated the 4 biggest factors that each individual can contribute. In ascending order: eat a predominantly plant-based diet, do without a long-haul flight, do without your own car, and, most important of all, do without another child. This is at least true if we don't become CO2 neutral, and yet all our children's children continue to cause high greenhouse gas emissions. The calculation is simple. The more people there are, the larger the ecological footprint.
Can we manage to get out of the overshoot so that humanity can manage with less than one planet? And the answer is yes. It is absolutely possible. Technically, it is already possible today. And it is also economically advantageous. The way out of overshooting is coming whether we like it or not.
Overshoot ends by design or disaster.
So, do we decide to find our own way, or will nature determine the solution for us?
We really have to ask ourselves something about the whole question of how much we are consuming and how much we are wasting. Is that sustainable? Rather than always put the lever on changing other people's reproductive choices.
So there we have our answer to whether or not there are too many of us. It's a matter of opinion. One thing seems clear though. There are too many people having too much fun.